So my name is Adrian. I'll be the moderator for today's conversation. We have a few documents that I referred to. So I think one of the interesting things maybe to bring up would be certain quotations as well. So I'll kind of start from there as well. And like what Dr. Carol Dowling mentioned, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists, creative practice has long been a way to assert identity, to maintain cultural continuity as well, and to speak truth to power. So artists like Iola, Brian, Tyrone, for example, you have all contributed powerful expressions of resilience. So I really want to start today's conversation with her quote, in which people in her community believe that artists are diplomats to the wider world as well. So I think in encountering the works yesterday, I do recall Ryan's provocation. Dr. Ryan Su was the guest of honor, but also a close peer, from NTU as well when we were doing a PhD. So I think one of the important ideas that he planted, and it kind of links to today's discussion, would be perhaps the idea of exchange taking place beyond the show as well. So please feel free to ask questions, feel free to give me eye contact, and we could have certain views that you may want to insert into today's conversation as well. So artists, or art as exchange for the artists, and also for those present here today as well. So first question, the idea that with Indelible Marks, we see over here, right? So it's going to be on till 19th of October.
Yeah.
So roughly about a month. So we do have the 6 artists over here. So we have Tyrone, we do have Iona, and then we have Nasru, right? And we have Desmond over there. And we have Izam and Brian online. The idea of how the curatorial intent is not to simply recount history, but it's also an attempt to interrogate memory, identity, and perhaps survival in this aftermath of what's happening globally as well. So it's getting a bit chaotic. So I really do hope that the show would kind of begin as an entry point, to kind of understand artistic practice. So that's why I hope to kind of bring into today's conversation that we encounter each artist's work and understand each artist's work as we look at it visually, but at the same time as we appreciate the various ideas that resonated, within each of your practice. So the works are a fruition of, various aspects of research, identifying with various new cultures as well, and also kind of trying to kind of contend with certain issues that you may face on a daily basis. Yeah, and one of the starting points was in 2022. I'm not sure how many of you were able to attend the exhibition called Ever Present, First People's Art of Australia in 2002. I attended it, and it was in 2022. I think it was on for quite a short duration, a couple of months.
National Gallery.
Yeah, at National Gallery Singapore. And I think it was the largest exhibition of its kind to travel to Asia, to NGS specifically, drawing from National Gallery of Australia, West Farmers Collection. The artwork showed a kind of deep interconnectedness between past and present as well. It was a celebration, celebration of the artworks, artistic production, or going back to what Dr. Carol Dowling mentioned about, creative practice asserting identity as well. So I wanted to ask that question to Desmond specifically as well, in kind of connecting to the starting point, or the idea you had early in the year, perhaps when you had a conversation with Izam as well, about the current state of art in Singapore. So many of you have been visiting shows, right? SG60, NEC funding, a lot of exhibitions, a lot of events going on. So maybe you guys could share a bit about the starting point of how you came up with this provocation in having this show, to kind of connect the two countries.
Okay, so this is my 3rd project that I do. My intention is to connect Perth to Singapore. If you ever been to Perth, Perth is a very isolated city compared to Sydney and Melbourne. So for a long time, artists in Perth finds it really hard to show anything beyond Perth. So I sort of tap onto my roots as a Singaporean, former Singaporean, and I try to connect Perth artists with Singapore art scenes. So this is the first time I actually got a good amount of funding for this project. I can't complain. And started when I had a conversation with Izam about SG60, what kind of shows will take place in Singapore during SG60. So we were talking about it, and most of it will be very pro-country and Singapore. So, but we wanted to do something that sort of ask questions, right? But not to provoke trouble, but just ask questions. So then we talk about, I share with him that we can talk about bringing Australian Aboriginal artists to come over to Singapore to share about their own cultural resilience and the racism and all the colonial histories, because colonial history in Australia and in Singapore is very different. Where I learned the bitter truth for myself, because I grew up in Singapore. Every day I say the pledge, we the citizens in Singapore. So when I moved over to Australia, I got shocked, because like, what happened to racial equality? Because I was told to go the F home where I come from, you know. And so I was going through that. I just like realized that racial equality doesn't really extend in certain countries, right? So, but then I don't understand both under sort of British system why it end up so different. So when I study Australian history, then I realized that how land was taken away from the Aboriginal First Nation people. So I thought it's very important for me to talk about this. You know, how does a culture that survived for so long, how does it look like? So I want to compare it with like Singapore.
I think the conversation started between Desmond and I when I first met Desmond a few years back, and we were in a show. Again, the conversation between Australian artists and Singapore artists, and the show is called The Lion and the Swan, Paper Trails. And then after that show, it was first exhibited here in Singapore, and then it went to Perth, and then a year later the conversation continued. And so that Desmond was telling me about, he wanted to continue this with like a new group of artists, and really focusing on, you know, the motherland, and also the people of the land. And that's where, the conceptualization kind of like continued. And then that Desmond and I, we were also like talking about the sense of identity and belonging, and we were really sharing a lot of our own personal experiences, and who are the artists that could also fit into the line of inquiry. Yeah.
In viewing the works, I was very drawn to Iona's works as well. And perhaps to me, there was a sense of cinematic presence even within what you showed, you know, the usage of cyanotype and the removal of certain forms as well. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that as an entry point to today's conversation when we talk about resilience. We talk about identity. Isam mentioned it earlier on as well. And I think one other aspect would also be about exchange, you know, through this journey of exchanging your ideas with the other artists. Maybe we could start with your piece over here, Bound by Blood.
The image that I'm referencing is the Australian flag. So by replacing the Union Jack in the top left corner, I've used two different images. Obviously, the horse is like a really interesting sort of symbol of colonisation to me. And I found the images really powerful kind of juxtapositions, especially the high contrast in the works. That are referencing the Australian flag colours, but also, the red being so strong and tied to that blood colour. Bound by Blood is more than just about bloodshed, but it's also about the familial connections between how we literally share blood through you know, really tragic circumstances where, for example, you know, Aboriginal female housekeepers were taken advantage of in certain situations. So yeah, those kind of power imbalances was a really important part of trying to depict this sort of two different identities connected to what it means to be an Australian. I always say that I don't even know what an Australian is. It's so strange, and you know, it's really interesting after speaking with Des about your experience in Australia, and you know, you move there or you become a citizen, and then people still see you as something different or another, and we find ourselves as, I'm sure a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would agree, that we're like refugees in our own country, living often in third world conditions. A lot of Aboriginal people were pushed out of the main city areas into these sort of pastoralist communities or reserves, where my grandfather and his parents were living in the early, I think around 1947, yeah, the 1930s. So my granddad is depicted in that one on the left, and he was about 12 years old in that image, and I just love it. It's and whenever I've seen a lot of non-Indigenous people seeing that image and they go, oh, that looks like Napoleon. I'm like, who's that? You know, no, I know who they're talking about, but I looked at the picture, I was like, oh, I never even thought of that. But it's interesting that, you know, there's this colonial figure, historical figure that they're looking at, and then I called it King Wally. My grandfather's name is Walter, so I called it King Wally. And he's a young black boy, you know, rearing this massive white horse, and I felt like that power dynamic in the sort of like just that frozen image of this like massive horse and this tiny little boy being able to do that was really interesting to me. So yeah, I pretty much photocopied that from this tiny little photo from that time, and from the original photograph, and blew it up. And then the image on the right is of a lady from the town of Carnamah in regional WA, Western Australia, and she was one of the earliest settlers that came from Scotland, and she settled the town with her husband, and they had Aboriginal people working on their farm, and they were not seeing any kind of payment or anything like that. They were pretty much slaves, and those Aboriginal people were actually children of the coloniser husband, I suppose. So there's that really dark part of history that not many people know about, or maybe they don't want to know about it. So Bound by Blood is not just by the bloodshed, as I've sort of depicted in the woven part on the left, but yeah, also through being literally related to each other in more ways than some people would like to admit sometimes. Yeah, so I just wanted to play with the materials as a way to build the context of the stories I'm trying to tell. So cyanotype being a way to use sun exposure, and the act of exposing something is the way that I like to tell the truth, you know, and that context around that medium is really, I mean, it's already kind of telling a story just through the use of the harsh sun, which was actually a lot of, there's a lot of stories around survival of the early settlers who came through really harsh areas of Australia. And as we all know, like, Australia is a very, you know, very harsh, intense environment, and you have to know how to read the land in order to survive it. So a lot of these settlers relied on Aboriginal trackers and people who knew how to read the land and use the resources of the land in order to survive it. So our culture being so hospitable and welcoming was actually taken advantage of from the very beginning, and opening that door, not knowing where it was going to lead to in the future, became, you know, the source of our demise in a lot of ways. So yeah, there's a lot going on there, but I find that the material is really important in my work. That also has to carry a story. So yeah.
for those of us who have actually attempted cyanotype, if you don't leave it in the sun long enough, it doesn't burn in the image long enough, it becomes a blurry, forgotten memory almost. So I think in kind of utilizing cyanotype, it's a craft that we kind of use and we learn when we start learning photography, for example, and to kind of adapt it and to include it, within the juxtaposition of the found object, the eagle feathers, and even this very big gesture of kind of removing or erasing aspects of the flag as well. Really brings me to the idea of mapping as well. Because in the works of Brian, I was quite intrigued by how the two works had different structures, meaning structures of visualization. Really quite intrigued by Brian's treatment of icons. So we spoke earlier on about how the identity of the character or the person on the horse could be mistaken for the icon of being Napoleon. But over here, if we look at the image a little bit longer, you realize that there are certain icons or iconography that resembles aspects of popular culture, things that we're familiar with. But at the same time, as a Singaporean looking at this, we are also looking at how the artist combines these forms together with map images, together with navigation devices, together with aspects of navigation, but also port cities, for example. So maybe Brian can share a little bit about this piece and talk a bit about the various icons and the ideas behind it. So Brian, please.
I'd be very, very happy to. And thanks for the invitation to speak today about the works. Sorry I can't be there in person, but the two pieces that I've sent over, one which is the piece on the screen, a work called Bedan Lag, Land of the Kaiwalagal. So this piece really looks at the mapping of the east coast of Australia by Captain Cook aboard the Endeavour. So you've got the Endeavour boat sort of smack bang, sort of in the centre of the work, but actually being carried on the back of a large stingray. So the stingray itself is one of my family's totem animals. So it's an animal that we sort of show respect to. We don't eat, and we pay sort of homage to this particular creature as well as several others that are connected to my family. And so you've got this large stingray, sort of gently nudging the boat up the east coast as the ships sort of navigating through waterways past sort of reef systems and things like that. So the title of the work, Bedan Lag. Bedan Lag is actually the traditional name for a small island in the lower western group of Torres Strait. A small island which is called locally Bedan Lag, but its English name is Possession Island. So it was actually the island that supposedly Cook went on shore and planted the English flag and claimed all of the waterways, all of the east coast, the river systems for England. And it's quite ironic because that little island has been the starting point, or sort of the foundation of all the land rights movements that have happened here in Australia since colonisation, basically, even back further, since European and other sort of countries came to the shores of Australia. And so this work here sort of looks at sort of mapping that particular event, but there's also the large map that is a scroll that sort of sits on the bottom of the piece in the lower right. And when you look at that particular map as well, and again it sort of connects to that whole idea mapping and sort of exploration. But when you look at the map, there's a little symbol of a pirate's sort of skull and crossbones. So again, it's sort of reinforcing that idea of this this sort of outside country, this outside force taking what is not belonging to them, and that's then reinforced again even further on the left with the use of the classic arcade Space Invader sort of icons. And so even though I grew up on a small island situated in the Torres Strait, the island itself only has a population, I think at that stage, of probably about 2,000 people. I was still heavily influenced by television, by cartoons, by comic books, and so all of these ideas, all of this little these little pop culture sort of icons and objects have been absorbed into my, I suppose, into my sort of memory, and it's now a part of my visual vocabulary that I sort of draw on to create sort of these works. And so the work does speak about that sort of connection to water and exploration of sort of seas, particularly the seas around Australia. It's all of these maps are then starting to be engulfed by all of this amazing sort of patination. So this particular mark making is traditional mark making from the Torres Straits, and it's a mark making which is called mineral. So mineral means design or pattern in traditional language from Torres Strait, from Kalalagaya. But once you start to compose all of these different patterns together, it's then a term called Kaidara, which means the spirit that creates the ripples on the surface of the water. So it's this idea of sort of Torres Strait culture slowly taking back sort of ownership of the land and waterways of the Torres Strait, but that then bleaching down into the east coast of Australia, and then sort of eventually right across Australia as well.
I think what was interesting was how she mentioned the use of maps. A lot of times we assume truths that maps tell us, directions, locations, relative locations as well. And I think with what is done here, it's also a kind of counter photography. I will use the word by Joanne Liao as well, in which she explores how various aspects of Singaporean counterculture, or even artworks, or films, or installations, or contemporary artworks, in a way are forms of counter maps in kind of Singaporean context. So in this case, I think what Brian has done is a very interesting entry point to the show. If you enter the space itself at Art Seasons, both books kind of frame the entranceway as well, and it's a huge piece, about 2 meters long as well, kind of resembling a map. But when you look up close, you do notice all the intricacies and the kind of whimsicality, as well as what you mentioned, minerals, right? The kind of method of drawing or mark making as well. And to me, I really resonated with Alia's work, although she's not here as well. For those of us present, we are familiar with batik. Some of you may even be wearing it today, for example. But the usage of batik prints, and I think in talking to her last night as well, where she introduced how she was very much interested in subverting perhaps how one would normally appreciate the prints of batik prints, where it's repetitive forms, where you have icons of famous flora and fauna from the region. But I think what she has really done over here is to include a series of texts, that to me resonated a lot in kind of bringing up her identity, but also approaching a very traditional craft in a slightly different way, in which you see the dissection of the national flower, the orchid. So bringing in the notion of identity and how she, as a young artist, is really maybe not struggling, but approaching it, approaching art making during this period when we're out elections. So when speaking to her, she was sharing how these almost felt like election boundaries, or the different boundaries that were withdrawn for this year's elections as well, and how the various negative spaces that you notice along it would also be, you know, her way of kind of responding to such a change as well. So to me, all these stories behind the pictorial images do make me think about our identity, but also how different artists approach it differently as well. So I think with that, I'd like to really, you know, introduce Izam and maybe getting to talk a little bit about identity, but also the materials that you have used in this piece. You know, it's a diptych. I think there are two pieces there. The use of Jawi text, which will kind of segue later as well. But maybe share a bit about the materials, the title, and to me it also seems like a personal map. There is a narrative being kind of built up there, and a lot of your works really deal with that identity, and also perhaps the tension or the binary between colors, forms, and art making practice that extends to performances as well, that goes beyond the canvas. So maybe Izam can share a bit about that.
I think for me, a lot of my works are mainly autobiographical, and I'm heavily based here, and a lot of my works really reflect on the situation that I'm in, or and also record the time and the happenings that is happening here in Singapore. And I always refer back to the body, as in like not only my personal body as a main medium, but also materials that is off the body. A lot of my sculptures are made out of my own skin, and for this particular work, I use anti-inflammatory plasters. As you age, you know, your body aches, and I'm wearing a couple actually inside my pants right now. So and after and again, these are like superficial materials, right? That is applied to the body, and once after after a period of time, I will collect them. And I'm not a hoarder, and I'm a clean person, trust me. So so I tend to look back at these materials as bodily remnants. For this particular work, Homeland, and I have another company, another piece of work called Tumpah Darah, means bloodshed, and these works were also an extension of an earlier performance that I did earlier this year in O Open House, where it was actually a site-specific performance. And if you notice the material, another material is actually genuine leather. Why I use leather is because it's also another extension of my body, and also there is an old wives' tale going around in the Malay community. This story has like it kind of like spread around, and it's actually about when the British came to Singapore. They met the Sultan and the Temenggung, and before they signed the treaty, the British asked the Sultan, can I have a plot of land to build a port, right, a trading port? And the Sultan said, how much land do you need? And the British actually unroll a cow's hide, and it's not that big. And of course, the Sultan and the Temenggung chuckled and said, sure, you know, that's the amount of land that you need. Go ahead. They signed the treaty. A few months later, the Temenggung and the Sultan walked by the shore and saw that the British has already reclaimed a lot of land and cut away a lot of and built a port. And of course, they were really surprised, and they confronted the British, and they said, why are you taking so much land? And it's supposed to be as big as a cowhide. And then the British said, it is the cow's hide. What they did was they sliced the cow's hide into thin thread and marked out the land. And when I was doing further research, there's a lot of colonial countries has different version of this story, and it also goes back to Greek mythology, where Queen Dido also did that. And then I spoke to someone from Hong Kong. The British did that in Hong Kong, but instead of using a piece of cowhide, they actually removed the sails and marked out the land, and that's how they claimed the land too. So so leather and skin and that's why this work homeland means the Jawi words is tanah air. It also goes back to me and my own identity as a Malay Singaporean. Our bodies are colonized, even the language I'm speaking right now, and especially being a Malay, I question again my Malayness, right? And before the spread of, the spread of Islam to the Malay archipelago, the Malays or the natives of this land reverted or converted to Islam, and we adapted Jawi, and Jawi is actually Arabic scripture with five extra Persian scriptures, and we read it as the English alphabet. So this is, and it's quite funny because like some of my audience or even my Malay friends say like, why are you writing in Arabic now? And I say no, they are not Arabic, they are Jawi, right? And we read the text as Bahasa Melayu, or the Malay language, and hence now I'm relearning self-taught. I'm not as good as Nas, but it's also difficult. But it also made me question why do the Malays adapt this language? So it's not only about colonialism, but it's beyond that, right? Like I question who am I as a person, as a native of this land, and again we're a copy of a copy of a copy. And our bodies are constantly colonized by both Eastern and Western influences.
And I think that's why in having known your practice all these years as well, I do find what you presented for this show really quite interesting, especially in and through what you have just shared earlier on about doing research and trying to understand not just your body, but your identity as well. And I think earlier, Yola mentioned about this search for identity too, and especially in Australia as well, where I used the word complex earlier on, but I think it's way beyond that as well in kind of comparing the two cities. But I think what is really interesting is how each artist within this show as well, not just utilizing research, but has also investigated into language, autobiographical way of approaching your practice all this while, but for the show, how you unpacked it in what you shared earlier on about using leather, using parts of your body almost, and even elements where you place on your body. You have this series of clay forms that you have strung together in this format, and behind what you see over here would be not just research, but some contestations you have regarding some information that you gathered either through a translation of Jawi scripts in how all these aspects of Singapore and during the colonial days, how the spaces were quite different. Personally, when I've been researching into Islamic art, but also into Singapore's colonial history. And do you all know that in and around Little India, there used to be huge plots of paddy or paddy fields as well. So all these were also made way and cleared to create colonial buildings or to create new streets as well. So to me, that's also another form of colonization. There's this removal of not just craft, but the removal of rights, the removal of something so vital for us as well. And agriculture, excellent. To kind of change the use of the space. Once again, linking back to elections, right? Anyway, so back to Nas as well. Maybe share a little bit about what these are meant to resemble and the various research that you have done. And also for Nas, he has been in Perth for the last 8 years. So as a Singaporean Australian artist, I think we kind of bring in this dimension to the show as well. So we spoke about Izam and his practice, and he asserted that his practice is very much Singaporean, about Singapore or here as well. And then Yona's work is really very much about the struggles or this tension that you kind of shared about how showing such works in Australia tends to have you being placed in certain exhibitions. So in this case, maybe I'll get Nas to kind of share about this work, which I find really intriguing as well.
Yeah, so as an artist practicing in Perth, I'm really interested in questioning how we know what we know and why do we believe what we believe and what we've been told. So I was listening to Dr. Farish Noor's lecture online about how some of the old, not really old, maybe poetry from the 1800s Singapore could be actually used as a secondary source of historical materials in better understanding Singapore beyond the textbook. So if we only look at source materials that fit into the Western model as legitimate, what about the local stories that have been recorded in the past couple of 100 years? Where do we put them? Okay, definitely not on the pedestal as we do so with official historical texts. So I was looking at Haji Tuan Simi's piece of poetry. So Haji Tuan Simi was alive during the early 1800s. He was a contemporary of Munshi Abdullah, who was at one point Raffles and Farquhar's secretary, if I'm not wrong. So he wrote a little narrative poetry about how the local traders, the local Malay, Bugis, and probably even the Chinese traders who have been here for the past 600 years, were affected by the new systems put into place by the EIC when they established the Port of Singapore. So when they introduced the system of the middleman that they brought in from Penang, maybe the other strait settlements, it sort of hampered the free trade that was already existing within the Riau archipelago that Singapore was part of. So the story says that the local traders were mistreated, and if there were any disputes, the Westerners were favored, and they were even encouraged to barter trade instead of getting payment in money. So there's some of these stories that we don't learn about in school, and we think that, oh yeah, the British opened up the port and everybody was happy and stories. But I think there are stories that are not told openly, and it should be probably discussed and dug a bit more, because I think history is definitely not set in stone, in this case in clay. That's why I tend to use, also because of my main practice, I use a lot of ceramic as my medium. And I wanted to actually think about the coins and money that has been circulating in the archipelago before the EIC's arrival. I mean, Singapore is in the middle of a very important trade route, right, from India to China, and it's smack in the middle. So according to University of Malaya's numismatic records, I looked at online, they have a collection of old coins that were found in the area, and we were looking at some of the Spanish dollar, even the Prince of Wales coin from the 1700s en route to the other side of the world. Some Bugis coins, Indian coins as well, that would have passed by Singapore. So I imagine that Singapore has always been bustling, and these people, the local traders, were involved in this huge commerce before the systems have been disrupted. So I think, yeah, the rapture that comes with the imposition of a new system affects them and somehow trickles down to the lives of the descendants of the merchants to this day. So I naively recreated some of the old coins that I saw in the numismatic records, and I strung them up like that, because Singapore is a sleepy fishing village, right? So I wanted it to look like a fish net. But apparently, I think we're starting to better understand Singapore's history at that time, that it's not just a quiet little swamp. It was bustling. It was part of a larger archipelago, part of a larger Malay dominion of the Sultanate of the Johor Riau Lingga region, and it had its own systems of economy. Yeah. So I think, yeah. What else? So the text I was reading was based off National Library Board's facsimile of a handwritten text. Handwritten Jawi is harder to read than printed Jawi. The way it's written is so quick and it's very cursive, and they would usually use the same letter to represent 3 different sounds, and I have to do a bit of guesswork just to make sure that this word actually exists in the modern Malay dictionary that I have. And then, like, along the way as I was doing this, talking to people about how I'm having trouble reading handwritten Jawi from the 1800s, Hafiz Rashid, one of a docent in the museum, gave me, oh, why don't you use the modern version, the one in the modern Malay? It's like, right, okay, you tell me this now. so that helped. It was quite encouraging to know that my sight reading is still pretty okay, and I got most of the words right, except for some very archaic terms that we no longer use. Yeah.
And I think the title to me was very compelling in how he kind of named it shackled economies as well. Yeah. And it's that gesturing to once again what's happening in the past. We're going back to Indelible Marks, colonization, but also looking at the economies beyond just spaces, beyond just containers of historical knowledge. I think that's why I really swing to Tyrone. Yes, he has 4 works in the show. And from what I understand, your background is essentially in design, in printmaking perhaps. what you produce here links to what we spoke about earlier on about fishing village. But in your case, from the image, from the print you see over here, you kind of use elements of fish and fish nets, to kind of bring these biomorphic forms that are morphing and changing, and even elements of the screen, perhaps in kind of looking at how the characters are kind of caged in as well. Maybe you can share a bit about the two works that we have here.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, these are kind of commenting on traditional fish traps from the Torres Strait Islands. So part of my heritage is Aboriginal and part of my heritage is Torres Strait Islander. But I've had massive severance from my Torres Strait Islander roots because it's pretty complex. But my dad was born and raised in Kwinana, which is a suburb of Perth, and his father was from a small island called Saibai. Unfortunately, he died in custody when my father was very young, which is a whole complex issue in Australia within itself. But yeah, essentially these fish traps in Torres Strait have been maintained for generations, and essentially a fish will swim in and then they can't swim out again because the openings goes from small to big. And then I link this to kind of kind of created my own mythology around it using referencing mermaid and fish people and this idea that's spread across the world of mermaids essentially. And then I've kind of used the netting in the background to allude to fish traps again, but it's also commenting on capitalism and commercialization largely. Like a lot of us kind of have to become professional Aboriginals to practice our culture in a way. And if you don't find a way to make money out of this thing, you don't really engage with culture, and it becomes almost like a hobby. And it kind of gets delegated to an after work activity. And but even now in Australia there's so much frustration around Aboriginal people being paid for their culture and their time, which is even more frustrating because this is the system we live in. It's capitalization, monetary system. You're going to be paid for your time, and even things we have Welcome to Country, and there's an uproar about that at the moment, and why are people being charging for this time when it's again, you get paid for your time, and this is supply and demand. We've created some demand for ourselves. But
there are two diptychs, so two works or four works on the wall, two of the similar colours here and the other two of a slightly different colours. It's a very strong intent, I think.
So the pink ones, they're from a. So I was requested by Curtin Gallery to do a direct response to the Carolup collection. The Carolup collection is a really important seminal artwork from Western Australia, and most of it sits within John Curtin Gallery. The Carolup was a reserve where lots of Aboriginal people had to live on, and one of the schools there, the kids started creating art, and then the art was later sold. But a lot of the artwork that they used was created from dust settings, so it's they used a lot of pinks and yellows, and as a response to that, I sampled some of these pinks and then used it as kind of blocked in color. For these ones, it was more of a kind of practical thing for me. Going through solo exhibitions, I was kind of I use a lot of color in my work, and it was taking up a lot of time just kind of finding new color schemes. So I thought I'd just have a limited color palette and reuse that constantly. I think a lot of my colors come from cartoons and oversaturated advertisement growing up. Everything's bright, poppy, and in your face. But I always think of these color schemes, even school uniforms in Australia is clashing colors. So I think it's somewhere deeply embedded in my brain.
What about the network of lines as well? Are they similar to what Brian shared about?
Yes, similar. So a lot of what I do, because I've had massive severance from a lot of my culture, or like at least my traditional culture on both sides, I do lots of like culturally adjacent things, where like it looks and feels Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, but it doesn't have that same kind of specific meaning a lot of the time. So yeah, I use patterns like that. I think for this one specifically, I was like thinking of water and how water reflects through on fishes and stuff. But even like markings on the arms and stuff, it's adjacent. It's reminiscent of body markings in Aboriginal culture, but it's not the exact thing. Yeah.
And also elements of glitches, perhaps. Are those meant to be like glitches?
Yeah, I think I was just trying to just block it in and yeah.
Interesting. And I think it's interesting too, because I think I forgot to mention this in Alia's work as well. A lot of her starting investigation starts from investigating into colonial botany drawings as well. So this is actually the Vanda Miss Joaquin. So she did share with me that quite a lot of her works deals with the kind of symbolism of some of these flowers, Southeast Asian flowers, And over there you have the Jantung Pisang, which actually links to myths and Pontianak and tales of Malay tales, for example. I mean, and talking about tales, we cannot really forget Desmond's work. For those, see the cameras come up already, but for those who have seen the work, you do notice that his starting point is also very textual. You need to go up close to look at how he has literally weaved the painting into form as well. I did ask him about, hey, did you refer to any reference images when you created this? And perhaps maybe you can share a little bit about the composition and the title as well.
So I'm also quite interested in botanical illustration because I realized that a lot of the botanical illustrations done by Western explorers, they go around collecting animals, plants, and then ignore whatever that's the previous names and rewrite it, and then and sort of like exotify it as well at the same time. So I thought maybe I could use that kind of language and re-look into colonial history. So this particular work was done because based on the point that I'm an idiot, right? Why I say I'm an idiot? Stupid, maybe. It's because I believe whatever the Ministry of Education tells me. So, so I have this stupid idea that Singapore history only begins with Desmond.Mah Utama, and then straight away skip everyone else and straight into the British Empire in Singapore. So I don't have very strong knowledge like our friend, both of them, about Jawi history and so on. I'm just an idiot, right? So I have to paint whatever is in my idiot mind. So my idiot mind is the tiger, because we are romanticized by the last tiger that was killed in Singapore. So there is like a reoccurring image in my head. And it's like a collective image at the same time. So we cannot go beyond Raffles, so that's why Raffles' words are stuck in his mouth, it's like there, go beyond that. So at the same time, if you go to the gallery, you can use your phone and tap on the QR code, and it releases an audio. Okay, a lot of my work has that sort of audio experience, because I think just looking at painting passively is actually quite boring. So I thought, why can't we just put an audio? So there's an audio to it. The audio doesn't explain to you the work. It's sort of like a accompanying nuisance that comes with the work. So it's like a mockery sort of thing. So you should listen to it. I've worked with audio because I find it's very interesting that we can use AI now to manipulate voices and sounds and stuff like that. So I'm sort of exploring that area. I had a chance encounter with TK about the other day, and I was telling him about my project, and he told me something interesting I didn't know. He told me that the word indigenous is illegal in Singapore because we come from a history of migrant background. We're not supposed to have indigenous culture. So I thought that's quite interesting. I've never looked at it that way. So so back to the painting. So I saw like idea of when Raffles signed the treaty to take over Singapore. So I tried to research what kind of gifts or exchange they would do, and I found out that the first thing he gave was opium. So I thought, well, it's very interesting because opium itself pays for a lot of infrastructure building in Singapore itself. So this is the rationale of this particular painting. Yeah, so it's like a true crime scene, you know. Let's visit the crime scene, see what is done, and we look at it besides the treaty and what else, you know.
And I think having said that, I mean, for me, this process of learning about the show through Desmond and also eavesdropping yesterday through various conversations that the artist had with visitors as well. that in a way, are you okay, Brian?
Yeah.
That in a way also made me, think about how to kind of conduct today's conversation, and I really wanted it to be an opportunity for those who turn up to also ask questions, perhaps based on the images, but also based on what we have talked about, through personal archives, through embodying your body, embodying your identity within your practice, looking at your craft through through economies and through various aspects of the past, and even looking at and knowing Desmond's practice as well, in kind of how he has literally weaved together his identity and tried to kind of take it away from the image as well, in using such strong iconographical images that can be mistaken or that can have certain certain readings as well. So I think it does kind of blend in with the title of the show, which is Indelible Marks as well, but also how this exhibition is essentially quite ground up and quite grassroots in a sense, to kind of bring in different cities almost to kind of come together, or different societies and civilizations in which there are commonalities, but there are also various divergences that takes place as well. Yeah, so I think to me that's interesting, and whether we could move to the last segment where there are any questions that we have a very healthy crowd today. Any questions that you have for anyone here, or we could have conversations in and across. Yeah. Yes, please.
Hi Desmond, I really like this work. What's the meaning of the shape?
Oh, yeah. So those shapes at the side, it could be chess pieces that we play. It's all game, isn't it? Where it could be a colonial power. Some people tell me it's UFO zapping away things from countries and stuff like that. So I just play with that sort of imagery. Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Oh, hi.
Why you choose the circle, the round shape of your...
Actually, a lot of my other works are always like the circular shape, from bell jars or like a round table. It's just a personal choice not to have corners, and I'm also embarking on a series of new works that bigger, larger scale circle canvases. Yeah. Nothing specifically like historical, but it's just like a personal aesthetic choice.
Maybe we can share a bit about the stolen generation.
Yeah,
because I don't think they know what is stolen generation.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, where do you even start?
Yeah.
Right? There's so much, but my brain was firing off when you all were talking, especially about economies and language and the weaponization of language, and that, I suppose, through the stolen generations is a really great way to understand the kind of tactics that were used and continue to be used in colonisation in Australia, because it's not just a one-off event, right? It's a system that continues to just decimate heritage and belonging and understanding our land and the stories of place. So yeah, the stolen generations was an outcome of many other different acts under a legislation called the 1905 Aborigines Act, and this was each state and territory in Australia had a chief protector who was basically like a governor, right? And a warden, yeah. And this act saw the management of like Aboriginal relationships. So suddenly Aboriginal children were seen as wards of the state, and this meant that there was a caste system that was put in place to categorise Aboriginal people according to blood quantum levels of Aboriginality. So say if a child had a pure blood or full blood Aboriginal mother and a white father, that child would then be seen as a half caste. And then, you know, you go down the line as this, the blood becomes more and more, you know, mixed with Aboriginal blood, then you get quarter castes and octocastes, and it's so ridiculous. So that was seen then to be justifiable to actually pluck Aboriginal children who were mixed into, and then institutionalise them in missions. So like the Carolup collection that Tyrone mentioned before was Aboriginal children that were put into those missions in the Katanning area of regional Western Australia, and they were taken from all over the state, and they would often be taken at night time as well, sometimes even blindfolded or put in the back of a truck that was covered, and so they wouldn't know where they were and how to get home, you know, using navigational skills that they may or may not have known at that time in their childhood. But yeah, they were taken away. My nana was somebody who was taken. Fortunately, my grandfather wasn't, but he ended up being, you know, enslaved on a farm pretty much. So it was sort of like lesser of two evils in a way. He was able to hold on to the language because of that. He was able to stay in contact with his family and pass on culture. So my family are fortunate enough to have inherited that from my grandfather. But for my nana, she was taken away and she wasn't allowed to speak to her parents. Her parents weren't allowed to come and visit or anything like that. And it was pretty much the government's way of identifying that if you had white blood, you were being able to be educated, you were able to be assimilated into the white culture. And for adult Aboriginal people, if you wanted to work, say, in the city or something, you would need something called a native pass. And that was, endearingly known as a dog tag, where you would have it signed by the Chief Protector to his discretion whether or not he wanted to award that to you. So you could go into the prohibition area of the main city in Perth in those early days. And but if you had that native pass, you weren't allowed to speak to your family, you weren't allowed to speak language, practice culture, do dance or ceremony or anything like that. So it was a really hard time for, you know, and this was only maybe 2 or 3 generations ago. And of course, because of that method of survival, a lot of Aboriginal people had to do that in order to earn for their family or to, you know, support. And we're seeing the effects of that now, where people are trying to return to their culture and their language or their family, and there's a rejection. It's like, well, no, you did that, you know, a couple generations ago. Your family decided not to be a part of this community anymore. So we're seeing a lot of that, the effects through, you know, domestic violence and alcoholism and separation. There's so many intergenerational traumas that are held because of that institutionalization of Aboriginal children and what happened to them in those institutions as well. You can imagine, you know, there was all types of rife abuse happening, and at the hands of people who were supposed to be protecting them, you know, by the hundreds. You know, there's children just packed into these missions. So that's a really heavy part of our history, and I know that Canada and, you know, America, they have very similar things. I'm not sure if something like that happened here, but that use of especially like taking language away, you know, not being able to speak to your siblings or your family in those places, using language against people is, I think, one of the classic tactics of, you know, the British colonists who, you then assimilate your tongue sort of thing, and then people are trying to get back to language and culture now. It's you know, and making a living out of it. And it's funny because now there's this, it's like a trending thing in a lot of ways. It's cool to be Aboriginal now in Australia, and we're like, oh, okay, great, because it would suck if it wasn't. No, but you know, it's a really interesting, and I found it a challenge in my arts practice, in the work that I make. People go, oh, do you make Aboriginal art? I'm like, I'm not sure what that means, but I make art and I'm Aboriginal, but I just try to tell stories from my family and from my own personal experience, because that tells, you know, 1,000 different things. And the stolen wages issue in Australia is another huge and very common story in a lot of Aboriginal families. For my grandfather here, he worked this farm for several years as a, you know, young man, and the owner of the farm was putting his earnings into a trust fund, and by the time, you know, he got to adulthood, he realised, oh, all I'd ever been paid in was to have the opportunity to sleep in the horse stable in the warmth of the hay, and be paid in rations of like flour, for example, for his family. So yeah, the farm owner ended up selling that farm. I looked it up and everything, and it was sold for a 7-figure sum. So that intergenerational wealth was built on the backs of this story that happens so much throughout Australia, where, you know, Aboriginal people were taken advantage of. And there's amazing stories of like Vincent Lingari, for example, for the Wave Hill Walk-Off in the north of Western Australia, who pretty much led a sort of a march or a what do they call it? A strike against the unfair payment and mismanagement of funds for Aboriginal workers, which the pastoralist industry in Australia was built on the backs of. So there's so much story, and I could go on for hours. So please stop me, somebody. Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Good morning. Are there any further? Yes, please. Open up questions. Hands.
So I'm for questions. I'm wondering if there's any questions raised between these different artists, participating artists, given the fact that there are artists from Australia, Singapore, and also between these two countries, pertaining to the question of settler colonialism. Because these two countries have very different attitudes towards this colonial past. So what are there any provocations that questions that if you have any questions for each other? Because on one hand you have a country that recognizes indigeneity to the extent that it becomes performative occasionally. On the other hand, you have a country that wouldn't recognize, especially the past, the concept of indigeneity, because of the fact that the country, Singapore is a kind of a migrant country. Right. So what are the questions raised that you can raise between each other?
Interesting that TK Sabapati would say something like that. I've never heard that the word indigenous is illegal to Singapore, because we sort of understand, although yeah, there's a lot of talk about how the Malays in Singapore are not indigenous to maybe Singapore itself, but if you have to look at it as beyond the modern state boundaries, where Singapore was part of a much larger, maybe smaller archipelago just nearby. So we are the Malays who have been living here are indigenous not just to Singapore, but to the Riau Islands as well, and some bits in Sumatra. As we know now that there's some orang laut in Singapore who are connected by family ties to people living in the southern islands and also in the Riau archipelago. Remember, we used to have the boat races that Singapore will be involved with the Riau Islanders. So that's how the idea of the indigeneity of the Malays here is more than just that understanding of, oh, these Malays were here living probably maybe in Jurong 5,000 years ago. That's not how the story goes. And I mean, the understanding of indigeneity is not just to that particular spot or street, but how the island is part of a larger story. So they're indigenous to not just that spot, but the whole area. And when we look at it from the eyes of maybe the understanding of people back then, these islands are separated now, but back then the waters was just a super highway for them to get across. Like my aunt lives in the other island, so my family story is there as well. So I think that's something that we could question and think about. Yeah, if you look at Mr. Samapati's statement, like how can we question that? Like what understanding of indigeneity does that come from?
But also, I guess the question stems from whether the artists within this period of organizing or co-organizing the show as well, whether there were conversations that pertain to, questioning each other's origins, perhaps. Which I would presume that will require a very long gestation period, multiple meetings on Zoom.
Do you have time for
That's a lot of time.
I've got a
Flags
comment
on.
related
Oh,
to
yeah.
that. I've got a comment related to that. Sorry, only by association with I didn't meet a lot of your artists, but then going around last night and reading. It's the first time I got to read the artist statements in the handbook, the program there, and I just think you go around, they look very different, these pieces of art, but they tell the same story in different ways. And I recognise something in an element in every single piece that relates to colonisation in Australia. It just, looks a little different in a different language, maybe,
But the
using
idea is the
different
same.
iconography,
Yeah.
but it looks exactly the same in every country. It's the usurping of resources. It's the renaming of iconic things that already have an Indigenous name or a long established name, and the imposition of an imposition of another language, law, legal system, social structure, where probably that one before was operating quite well. But it looks different, but it's kind of the same concept. So colonisation looks the same in every place you go.
Even though, like last night when I was having a conversation with someone and I was like, what's that sound? It's like, ding, ding, ding. And it was your work next to me. I was going, oh, it sounded like shackles. And I was like, oh my gosh, are the ancestors here? But and then I was like, oh, of course, your work. And just the soft kind of sound of the clanging against the wall was really haunting. So it was sort of multi-dimensional in that way.
That was by design.
Yeah.
I have to clarify something, right? There's no fan on top of the coins, alright? So it's just children speaking, I think.
Spirit of colonialism.
However, we have the air conditioning vent.
It was quite cool in there.
Yeah, I think it's that soft whispers of the past, like how we, look at our history and our shared history, or even how can we compare?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we can't compare. My people were treated differently from your people, from people from the same system.
Yeah.
But I think in every country, the colonizers would do as they wish to get. I mean, we're all a means to an end at that point.
Yeah.
So treatment is different. But I think the outcome, in essence, is similar. Yeah. The goal is the same.
There's a question from behind and then later Ishan,
Okay, who will you?
Yeah, the gentleman behind.
Yeah.
Thanks for the sharing. Thanks for the sharing. It was very thought-provoking. It was just triggered by what Elena and us was, not triggered, sparked by what you guys were sharing about the school generations and how history is still here with us. And I have two related questions. One on processing of trauma and the other on agency. So, I mean, we know that colonialism has happened, right? But people tend to think of the present as just a snapshot. You don't think about how history reverberates and continues to reverberate through time. So the traumas that we all encountered, indigenous trauma, even everyone else has gone through a lot of things that we have not necessarily processed as a society, as a collective, to deal with all these things. So just going back to the issue of framing, the British and the colonial masters framed indigenous people as weak, as pathetic, as not smart, as people that needed to get lifted. You can see this in Singapore as well, right? So as in, when you look at discourse about Singapore Malays, you always highlight that the Malays have the highest drug rate use in Singapore, highest divorce rates, that kind of thing. And there's always a narrative, even though it's a positive narrative, but it's like, okay, we need to make sure that we do something to bring up the community, which sort of frames us as permanent victims, right? So I'm just thinking about this idea of framing. How do we change it? So the first thing I wanted to hear from you guys was, I think processing of trauma is important, collectively processing this trauma from history to be able to move on from it, instead of leaving it as something that hasn't been processed yet, right? So in terms of your art, have you guys thought about how your art can speak to help people process these brutal things that happened in the past? Also to present more positive stories about the future. And you guys have also been doing this in your art, right? It's like we are not victims. How do we make sure that we can structure or agency, because all the people in these communalized spaces have been living and been trying to live our lives, and we have pride in a way that we would not see. So I just wanted to hear stories about grappling with these two big issues.
Thank you for the question.
I think the way to go forward from my position, especially when I know I really say I have an idiotic education background, I've sort of trained yourself to read more and consider alternatives perspective. And ultimately, we can't change anything. It's really all done, set in stone in a way. But what we can do is to form pockets of resistance and to talk about the alternative way of looking at history. And like for me, I will revisit back in history and do a speculation of history. So my work can be speculative in a sense, right? To give people fruit for thoughts and things like that. So this is a little bit of things that I do to sort of address whatever that's have done in the past. All right. Obviously, because in Singapore we are so comfortable, you know, and we don't tend to question, and even if you question, it comes with consequences. So how do we do that, right? So I guess it's about using the art space as a alternative space to talk about all the diverse voices that is like muffled out by the mainstream propaganda. So I think this is why art is so important, and more people should come. But unfortunately, it is difficult because of like art always been seen as like hierarchy, you know, that people who go buy art and stuff like that. So maybe future program will incorporate, bring into like teaching of this alternative way of looking at things to the bigger audience. Maybe that will change, you know. So we will become more accepting of each other. We not be straight away create prejudice view because of skin color or culture and so on. I understand that, because even though we look at Singapore, right, we're supposed to be multicultural, but there is a very strong hidden way of looking at people, you know, racism and so on.
I think going back to your question, navigating our artistic practices, I'm not speaking on behalf of the artist, but for myself, like, we all have different facets of our practice, and this is one of it. And I don't think any of us are trying to self-victimize, like, oh, look at us, poor me, we are this, we are that, you know. I think it's also through our practices that we kind of like forefront these issues, and to remember to also position ourselves as the voices for the unheard, the voices that are silenced sometimes. That's how I position myself as a Singaporean artist, Singapore-based artist. And going back to, you know, like looking at the identity as artists, we always look at the internal first, and then also respond to the issues that are around us. And that's how I position myself as a creative, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, like, what I try to do is just kind of like reflect, like hold a mirror up and create like some type of metaphor where other people, especially like white Australians, will understand. Like, I think there is like this really big sentiment that exists largely over Australia that like Aboriginal people are just never going to be good enough. Like there's this bar set that continually grows, and even if you do well enough and good enough, you then get put in this position of like, look what you can be, and if you're not that good, you're not good enough. And it's like, yeah, it's just an endless thing. So I like to like really try and hold a lens up and make people like, this is the way you make us feel, think about that. Yeah, because even like, I feel like even with like white Australians who are friendly, there's still this sentiment where it's like, yeah, you're being put on some weird type of pedestal, and then you're being, other Aboriginal people are being compared to you, and it's odd. I don't like it.
And maybe I can add on just a little bit before Ishan as well. I mean, I guess Isa mentioned about position, but I do see presence as well, in which, if you do notice in contemporary art, we do have artists who embed their practice with such urgency and also with such concern and what do you call that, awareness of our past. And I think when talking to Aliyah as well, as a young artist, I do identify with how she is very much intending on including such elements of being aware of social, cultural, political situations and embedding it into the work as well. And I think maybe even Robin, and for those of us who are kind of like teachers or educators in our local arts institutions, we do see students who really want to research into our history, to find out more about our past, and to look at our older generation contemporary artists, also look at what we have right in front of us as well. So I think it's something to kind of think about, not just in visual arts perhaps, but maybe beyond that, in theatre and in dance, music, etc. So maybe, yeah, Ishan can ask a question.
Okay, so I've got a couple of questions. One of them is I'm curious about like over a decade ago, I heard about an Aboriginal Australian taboo against depiction of dead persons in images, and I was wondering. I feel like I've been hearing less about that recently, and I was wondering how that taboo is negotiated today. I'm also curious about the what sort of this perception is in the Aboriginal Australian community towards Asia and Southeast Asia. When I was in Darwin once, I was hearing people talk about this idea of like remembering Makassarese contact as an example of positive cosmopolitanism that didn't have to result in colonization. But I'm wondering if there's still this kind of optimism towards Asian contact.
Okay. Brian, do you want to talk about this? No. Can't hear. Oh, okay. Maybe you ask about that question again.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm asking about the taboo regarding the representations of dead people in Australian Aboriginal culture. Whether it's still an important thing, and also relationships towards perceptions of Asia and Southeast Asia in the Australian Aboriginal community.
Okay, right?
No volume.
No volume. All right. Maybe you answer. Okay.
Yeah, no.
Sorry about that. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So in
you sure?
regards
Say
to the photo thing, I think that's sort of a contemporary extension of the practice of not. Sorry, that's weird. Of not speaking somebody's name once they've passed. So that we have a lot of throughout the different Aboriginal cultures across Australia. There's lots of different names that you use as a replacement name rather than speaking the deceased person's name. And that's, I think, more of a spiritual sort of practice as to like letting the spirit move on rather than calling it back here. So you let it go on its journey sort of thing. So there's like, some names like Nyabru is a name that people called my dad, because my dad was named after his father, who was in the artwork, Walter. So for a long time, my dad was known as Nyabru. And that's just a cultural name that you use. And when people use that, they know that it's a replacement for a while until that person feels like it's right again to say that person's name. So I think the photo depiction is sort of an extension of that practice, because obviously we didn't have cameras in traditional lifestyle. So it's just about letting that, some people will put photos away of that person and put it in hiding sort of thing until, there's healing and things, and then you're able to return to that person. Interesting question about Makassar though. I was there last year for an artist residency, and it was really to explore that relationship. And I'd say there's a really exciting space where that optimism is growing around the connection that we have with like Southeast Asia and Indonesia and all these great places with really strong socio-political activist artists, and yeah, really interesting commentary around colonisation. So, because we were all sort of affected around the same time. So, yeah, we've got a lot of synergies there culturally, but yeah, also historically, that I think those conversations have been going for a while. I mean, that relationship I know with Arnhem Land and not just Makassar, but generally Indonesia, was happening, I think, 600 plus years ago or so. And then when I was there, I was doing this panel discussion around that, and there are a few Australian representatives, like consul generals, and they were like, "Oh, we're celebrating, 50 years of relationship with," and we were all sat on the same panel going, "This is not the same thing." And I just said, I want to make it clear, like, there's a political relationship between the governments. That's a 50-year thing, and then you've got the Indigenous and, Indonesian relationship that's a friendly, like, economical kind of trade network that's been strengthened over 600 plus years. Like, you can't compete. So, it's just interesting that you're seeing, like, government trying to muscle in on these things for benefit in a way to make it look like they've been a part of this thing. But yeah, there's something much more grounded and grassroots, I think, and telling these stories that are really raw and difficult. For me, like, just tying back to that previous question around victimhood and things, I'm always trying to navigate, how do I make work that's informative to people who aren't informed, but not re-traumatizing for my mob, my people, to see it and feel empowered that yes, our stories are being told in this way, this truthful way, and just trying to be a part of a trend, I guess, in Australia about truth telling and truth listening. So yeah, it's just I'm trying to elevate and amplify voice of the voices that have been silenced since colonisation. So yeah, this is a part of that for me, and I feel this is a way more empowering way, connecting with people outside of Australia who actually care, and it feels like sometimes in our own place that you're just sort of yelling out into the abyss and nothing's sort of coming back. Yeah. It's just like an endless kind of trying to grasp onto people who understand or are able to reflect their ownership over our shared history. Like, how do non-Indigenous people hold our history? I don't know. It's really hard to tell. It's a different story with whoever you meet in Australia, but this has been a really interesting space to explore these histories that have a lot of synergy. So
I think this kind of exhibition also allow us to open up this conversation, and not only that, it also it's just a tiny entryway, right, or an introduction to the audience, and of course there's a bigger conversation that like we can continue, and it will just like go on and on and on, and if we want to conceptualize every question, and I don't think the 7 of us have all the answers too. So so come to the show. And check out the work yourselves.
You have to see the work itself, because pictures doesn't do justice.
I do have a question. Are there plans for another show after this?
Who are you talking to? I've been talking to Ilona, so we are thinking of doing something. We will be back in Perth. Yeah, so you guys have to go to Perth. So Thomas, I'll let you do the last question because you're such a patient person. Yeah, so Thomas, please fire away.
Oh no, I was just saying that I'm very appreciative of the fact that I got to go to the show last time. And I think the idea of Indelible Marks is such a interesting and kind of generative prompt. And I think one of those markings that I am seeing in your work is on the land, specifically in Australia. We see how white settler colonialism transformed land from this collective and shared resource into this division between reserve and then land that was held for settlers and freely given to Europeans. I think it's a shared thing between Australia and Canada where they set posters up in Europe and say, free land, come here, settle here, just come here, farm, and we'll give you this land for free. And then on the flip side in Singapore, we have this transformation of land from this meeting point of different empires and trade to this construction of this very imperial port. And we have these two kinds of land divisions that I think are something that all the artists here are in some way discussing. And I'm kind of wondering, especially because we're talking about these two different land technologies almost, I'm wondering if the artists were able to look at someone who is working on a different idea from them, and if they've noticed something in another artist's work that has helped them to broaden their horizon towards the way colonialism still works on us today, or something that has kind of allowed them to consider their own kind of embodiment here today, or just kind of maybe something else in somebody else. I guess I'm more interested in what, by engaging in other artists' work, is there something about colonialism and the differences in colonialism that have allowed you to take something back and consider how to grapple with those colonial legacies in the places where you come from?
Yes, I want to answer that as a migrant who live in Australia. I don't feel like I belong there, and neither I do feel belong in Singapore either. But I think I will be seen as a troublemaker here. So I find that living in Australia has somehow created me, give me more capacity to empathize with people. And talking to my friends here, I kind of understand where their entry point of racism comes about. And to be honest, the last referendum, I cried. Even though I'm Asian, right? I cried because I felt, oh, what does that mean when Aboriginal welcome us in this language in the country, welcome the country, but they don't feel welcome in their own land? Yeah. So I take that very seriously. I thought about it. I thought, oh, maybe another 10 years we will see some sort of real change, because you can see the younger generation doesn't think like the old views, So I think it will take time to see changes. And what I learned from this is through their own personal work that they made, I have developed more understanding of unceded Aboriginal history. What's it about, and how they continue their storytelling. Why is it so important to do this? So I felt that's good because that's what I learned, and because Australia is still my home, and it helps me to see things a little bit better. That's all I can say. If I answer a question.
I think that's a great thing. I guess we can talk later about.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
I think engaging is definitely such an important thing to do, and can be such a great way to think about how different kinds of colonialisms interact with each other.
Okay, we will let the laughing old man or the senior citizen that's here to have the last say. Do you have anything you want to say to the crowd that's here?
I unfortunately didn't hear most of it because of technical difficulties, which is a real shame, because I wanted to connect more with the participating artists in the exhibition, to see what sort of inspires them to sort of create the work that they do. I myself, even though there's the exhibition that I'm a part of, the Indelible Marks, sort of looks at that sort of that colonial history, and sort of slants a little bit on the political sort of side of things. I myself, I would never class myself as a political artist in any stretch of the imagination. I'm a visual storyteller. sort of create what I see. And a lot of the time, my head is stuck in fantasy realm. And that's why I sort of pick and choose elements from, sort of history, whether that's current history, ancient history, pop culture, and I sort of mix it all together so it becomes a cohesive sort of palette for people to understand and for people to enjoy. There are elements of, that are political stance in there, I must say, but I wouldn't, sort of class myself as, a political artist in any stretch of the imagination. So I wanted to connect more with the artists that, were here today and hear their stories, basically. I love the idea about the skin, or the skin of the hide, or the sails being torn up to mark our boundaries. That's an amazing story.
Right.
Something that I will myself to build on that story, because I thought it was absolutely amazing. I've exhibited with Tyrone on a number of occasions as well. Amazing, sort of young Torres Strait Islander man, and I'd like to, to do on that as well. And
we lost the audio already. Okay, we come back in.
Desmond talks to me, sort of both online, when I'm up in Perth. It's amazing to be a part of this. Not really frozen.
Delay.
It's alright. There's a delay. You can tell me the personal love story later. All right. Alright. So I think we will yeah. Right. Thank you. I think we will wrap it up. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for spending time here.
Thank you, Commerce Space.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commerce Space. Thank you, Robbie.
Okay, let's do a group picture with Brian on mine as well.